Jake stood on the bustling city street, his eyes darting from one passerby to another. He blended seamlessly into the crowd, just another face in the sea of people rushing to their destinations. But Jake wasn't like them. He was a predator, and they were his prey. His gaze locked onto a well-dressed businessman talking loudly on his phone, oblivious to his surroundings. Jake's fingers twitched, itching to reach into that pocket and liberate the man's wallet. But no, not yet. The timing wasn't right. He needed something bigger, something that could change his fortune. As Jake scanned the area, his attention was drawn to the community center across the street. The doors opened, and out stepped an elderly woman. She moved slowly, her steps careful and measured. In her hand, she clutched a large handbag. Jake's heart raced. This was it, the perfect target. He watched as the woman, Martha, made her way down the street. She stopped to chat with a few people, giving Jake time to plan his approach. He moved casually, keeping pace with her from a distance. As Martha reached a quieter stretch of sidewalk, Jake saw his opportunity. He quickened his pace, closing the gap between them. Just as he was about to make his move, Martha turned slightly, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment. Jake faltered for a second, caught off guard by the kindness in her gaze. But desperation won out. In one swift motion, he grabbed the handbag and yanked it from Martha's grasp. The sudden action caught Martha by surprise. She let out a startled cry, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of the street. Jake's triumph was short-lived as he realized his mistake. Heads turned, and people began to shout. Jake ran, the stolen bag clutched tightly to his chest, unaware that this impulsive act would set in motion a chain of events that would change his life forever. Jake's feet pounded the pavement as he sprinted away from the scene of the crime. His heart raced, pumping adrenaline through his body. He dodged pedestrians and weaved through alleyways, the stolen handbag clutched tightly against his chest. A grin spread across his face as he realized he'd gotten away clean. But his victory was short-lived. As he rounded a corner, his foot caught on an uneven section of sidewalk. Jake stumbled, losing his balance. The bag flew from his grasp, its contents scattering across the ground. Cursing under his breath, Jake dropped to his knees. He frantically gathered the spilled items, shoving them back into the bag. Wallet, keys, makeup, compact, all went in haphazardly. His hands trembled with urgency as he heard distant shouts growing closer. As he reached for a small, framed photograph, Jake paused. The image showed Martha, smiling beside an older man, her husband, he assumed. Something about their happy expressions made Jake's stomach twist uncomfortably. Before he could dwell on the feeling, a chill ran down his spine. He became acutely aware of the silence that had fallen around him. Looking up, Jake found himself surrounded by a group of stern-faced onlookers. Some pointed accusingly, while others already had their phones out, undoubtedly calling the police. Panic set in as Jake realized he was trapped. He clutched the bag to his chest and tried to push through the crowd, but firm hands held him back. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Within minutes, a police car pulled up. Two officers stepped out, their faces grim. Jake's shoulders slumped in defeat as he was handcuffed and led to the patrol car. As the door closed behind him, he caught a glimpse of Martha in the distance, her face a mixture of relief and something he couldn't quite identify. Was it pity? The reality of his situation began to sink in as the car pulled away. Jake leaned his head against the cool window, wondering how it had all gone so wrong so quickly. Jake sat on the hard bench in the police station, his head bowed low. The harsh fluorescent lights made the stark reality of his situation even more apparent. He'd been fingerprinted, photographed, and left to wait. The shame of his actions weighed heavily on him. As he waited for the inevitable interrogation, Jake's mind raced. How had he ended up here? He thought back to his first petty theft, the rush it had given him, and how it had spiraled into a way of life. Now, sitting in custody, that life seemed hollow and pointless. The door opened, and Jake looked up, expecting to see a stern-faced detective. Instead, he was shocked to see Martha walk in. She moved with purpose, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on him. Jake felt exposed under her gaze, unable to look away. Martha approached him, her expression a mix of emotions Jake couldn't quite decipher. As she got closer, something in her face changed. She paused, studying him intently. Jake shifted uncomfortably, wondering what she saw. "You remind me of someone," Martha said softly, more to herself than to Jake. Before Jake could respond, an officer approached. "Mrs. Thompson, are you sure you want to speak with him?" Martha nodded firmly. Yes, I'm sure. Jake braced himself for anger, for accusations. But when Martha spoke, her voice was calm and measured. I want to know why, she said simply. The question caught Jake off guard. He opened his mouth to make an excuse, to deflect, but something in Martha's eyes stopped him. For the first time in years, Jake felt the walls he'd built around himself begin to crumble. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't think. I never wanted to hurt anyone. As Jake stumbled over his words, he saw a flicker of understanding in Martha's eyes. She had been a judge, he remembered. She must have seen countless people like him. Yet there was no judgment in her gaze, only a deep searching look that made Jake feel as if she could see right through him. In that moment, Jake felt a strange mix of shame and hope. For the first time, he wondered if there might be a way out of the life he'd chosen. The courtroom fell silent as Martha stood up. Jake watched nervously from his seat, his hands cuffed in front of him. He'd expected her to demand the harshest punishment possible. Instead, her words left him stunned. Your Honor, Martha began, her voice clear and confident. I'd like to propose an alternative to imprisonment for Mr. J. Collins. The judge leaned forward, intrigued. Go on, Mrs. Thompson. Martha outlined her proposal. Jake would participate in a rehabilitation program instead of serving jail time. She spoke of second chances and the potential for change. Jake listened, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. As Martha finished, the judge considered her words. Jake held his breath, his future hanging in the balance. Finally, the judge nodded. Given Mrs. Thompson's recommendation and her experience as a former judge, I'm inclined to agree. Mr. Collins, you will be released on the condition that you complete this rehabilitation program. Fail to do so, and you will face the full extent of the law. Do you understand? Jake nodded vigorously. Yes, Your Honor. Thank you. As he was led out of the courtroom, Jake's mind reeled. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope. The next day, Jake found himself standing outside a nondescript building. A sign read, New Beginnings Rehabilitation Center. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the door. Inside, he was greeted by a group of young people, all with stories similar to his own. Some looked defiant, others nervous. Jake recognized the mix of emotions he felt mirrored on their faces. A counselor introduced herself and explained the program. There would be therapy sessions, job training, and community service. It wouldn't be easy, but it offered a chance at a new life. As Jake took his seat in the circle, he looked around at the faces of his fellow participants. He saw fear, hope, and determination. For the first time, he didn't feel alone in his struggle. The counselor began the session, and Jake found himself listening intently. As others shared their stories, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he could turn his life around. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in years, Jake felt ready to face the challenge. The therapy room was quiet except for Jake's voice. He sat in the circle, his hands clasped tightly in his lap as he spoke about his past for the first time. I never knew my dad, Jake began, his voice low. Mom tried her best, but she was always working. I practically raised myself on the streets. The other participants listened intently. Some nodded, recognizing their own stories in Jake's words. I started stealing when I was 12, Jake continued. At first, it was just to eat, but then it became a way of life. As Jake shared more of his story, he felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. The counselor asked questions, guiding him to confront the pain and anger he'd buried for so long. After the session, Jake lingered in the hallway, processing the emotions that had surfaced. That's when he saw a familiar face approaching Martha. She smiled warmly as she walked up to him. Hello, Jake. How are you doing? Jake was surprised by her presence. Mrs. Thompson? What are you doing here? I volunteer here sometimes, she explained. I like to check in on the progress of the participants. As they talked, Jake realized that Martha's interest in his rehabilitation was genuine. She asked about his therapy, offering words of encouragement. Over the next few weeks, Martha became a regular presence at the center. Jake watched as she interacted with the other participants, offering support and advice. Her dedication inspired him. Motivated by Martha's example, Jake threw himself into the program. He attended every session, actively participated in group discussions, and even volunteered for extra community service hours. One day, the center organized a project to clean up a nearby park. Jake found himself enjoying the physical work and the sense of accomplishment it brought. As he planted flowers and picked up litter, he caught sight of Martha watching him with a proud smile. For the first time in his life, Jake felt useful. He was no longer just taking from society, but giving back. The change in him was noticeable. He stood taller, spoke more confidently, and even began to smile more often. As the weeks turned into months, Jake realized that he was no longer just going through the motions. He was actively working towards a better future, inspired by Martha's unwavering belief in second chances. The community center buzzed with activity as Jake moved from table to table, ensuring everything was in place for the fundraising event. He adjusted a banner, straightened chairs, and checked the microphone one last time. Nervous? A familiar voice asked. Jake turned to see Martha approaching, a warm smile on her face. A little, Jake admitted. I've never organized anything like this before. Martha patted his shoulder reassuringly. You've done a wonderful job, Jake. This event will make a real difference for the center. As guests began to arrive, Jake greeted them with newfound confidence. He chatted easily with community leaders and potential donors, his passion for the center's work evident in every word. The highlight of the evening was Martha's speech. Jake watched from the sidelines as she took the stage, presence commanding the room's attention. Good evening, everyone, Martha began. I'm here to talk about second chances and the power of community. As Martha spoke about the center's impact, she caught Jake's eye and smiled. I'd like to introduce someone who embodies the spirit of transformation. Jake, would you come up here? Surprised, Jake made his way to the stage. Martha gestured for him to take the microphone. Taking a deep breath, Jake faced the audience. A year ago, I was a different person, he began, his voice steady. I was lost, angry, and alone. But thanks to this center and people like Martha, I found my way back. Jake spoke from the heart about his journey, the challenges he'd overcome, and his hopes for the future. As he finished, the room erupted in applause. Jake saw tears in some eyes, and many nodded in appreciation of his honesty. After the event, as they cleaned up, Martha approached Jake. You did wonderfully, she said, her eyes shining with pride. How do you feel? Jake paused, considering. I feel like I belong, he said finally. Like I have a purpose. Martha nodded, understanding. That's the power of community, Jake. When we lift each other up, we all rise. As they continued working side by side, Jake realized how far he'd come. From a lonely thief to a valued member of the community, his transformation was a testament to the power of second chances and the impact of one person's belief in another. Jake's phone buzzed late one night as he was preparing for bed. The number wasn't saved in his contacts, but he recognized it immediately. His heart raced as he answered. Hello, he said cautiously. Jake, my man. A familiar voice boomed through the speaker. It was Ray, an old friend from his past life. Long time no see, buddy. How have you been? Jake hesitated, memories of his old life flooding back. I'm doing all right, Ray. What's up? Ray's voice lowered conspiratorially. Listen, I've got a job lined up. Big score, easy in and out. Could set us up for months. You in? The old Jake would have jumped at the opportunity without a second thought. Now he felt a knot forming in his stomach. I don't know, Ray. I'm not really in that life anymore. Come on, man, Ray pressed. One last job, for old time's sake. Think about it, no more scraping by, no more answering to anyone. You could be your own man again. Jake's mind raced. The promise of easy money was tempting. He thought about all the things he could do with that kind of cash, maybe even donate some to the community center. But then he remembered Martha's face, the trust she'd placed in him, the progress he'd made. I need to think about it, Jake said finally. Can I get back to you? Ray agreed, and Jake hung up, his head spinning. He barely slept that night, tossing and turning as he weighed his options. The next morning, Jake walked to the community center, lost in thought. As he approached, he saw Martha outside, tending to the small garden they'd planted together. She looked up and waved, her smile warm and genuine. In that moment, Jake made his decision. He pulled out his phone and dialed Ray's number. Hey, Ray, he said when his old friend answered. About that job, I'm out. For good. I got a different life now, and I'm not giving it up. I hope you understand. Ray's disappointment was clear, but Jake stood firm. As he hung up, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He walked over to Martha, ready to start another day of honest work, secure in the knowledge that he'd made the right choice. The youth shelter was a stark contrast to the community center Jake had grown accustomed to. The walls were bare, the furniture worn, and the air heavy with a mixture of desperation and hope. Jake followed Martha as they made their way through the cramped hallways. "This is where many young people end up when they have nowhere else to go," Martha explained, her voice low. "I thought it might be good for you to share your story here." Jake nodded, feeling a mix of nervousness and determination. As they entered the common room, a dozen pairs of eyes turned to them. Jake recognized the look in those: suspicion, defiance, and hidden vulnerability. It was like looking into a mirror of his past self. Martha introduced Jake to the group, and he stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Hey, I'm Jake," he began, his voice steady. "A year ago, I was where many of you are now. Lost, angry, thinking the world was against me." As Jake shared his journey, the theft, his arrest, and the unexpected second chance, he saw the expressions around him change. Some leaned in, listening intently. Others crossed their arms, skeptical but curious. "It wasn't easy," Jake admitted. "There were days I wanted to give up, to go back to my old life. But with support and hard work, I found a new path. And if I can do it, so can any of you." As Jake finished speaking, a familiar face caught his eye. In the back of the room stood Carlos, an old acquaintance from his days on the streets. Carlos's eyes were hard, his posture challenging. After the talk, as the youths dispersed, Carlos approached Jake. "Nice speech," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Didn't take you for a sellout, Jake." Jake felt a flicker of his old anger, but pushed it down. "It's not selling out, Carlos. It's growing up." Carlos leaned in close. "You think you're better than us now? Don't forget where you came from. Once a street rat, always a street rat." As Carlos walked away, Jake felt a wave of doubt wash over him. He thought he'd left his past behind, but Carlos's words hit a nerve. Could he really change? Or was he just fooling himself? Martha, sensing his unease, placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You okay?" Jake nodded, but inside, he felt the old familiar pull of his past life, questioning everything he'd worked so hard to build. Martha sat at her desk, a box of old papers spread out before her. She'd been meaning to sort through her late husband's belongings for years, but had never found the strength. Now, as she sifted through the documents, a yellowed envelope caught her eye. Curious, she opened it, pulling out a faded newspaper clipping. The headline made her gasp: "Local man turns life around, from thief to community hero." The article detailed her husband's past as a young criminal and his subsequent rehabilitation. Martha's hands trembled as she read. How had she never known this? The similarities between her husband's story and Jake's were uncanny. She felt a mix of shock, confusion, and a strange sense of clarity. This discovery ignited a desire in Martha to understand Jake's situation better. She began digging deeper into his background, using her connections from her days as a judge to gather information. What she uncovered was troubling. Jake's old friend, Ray, wasn't just a petty criminal. He was involved with a dangerous gang, one that didn't take kindly to members trying to leave. Martha's concern grew as she learned more about the gang's tactics. They often used threats and violence to keep people in line or to punish those who tried to break away. As she pieced together the information, Martha realized the danger Jake might be in. His refusal to participate in Ray's job could have serious consequences. Just as Martha was considering how to approach Jake with this information, her phone rang. It was the community center. There had been a break-in, and several items were damaged or stolen. Martha rushed to the center, her heart pounding. When she arrived, she found Jake already there, his face pale as he surveyed the damage. Who would do this? Jake muttered, picking up a shattered picture frame. Martha watched him, wondering if he suspected what she now knew. She debated whether to share her discoveries with him. Would it help protect him, or would it only push him back towards his old life? As Jake turned to her, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and determination, Martha made her decision. She would tell him everything. They would face this threat together, just as her husband had once faced his past with support and courage. "Jake," she said softly, "there's something I need to tell you. It's about your past and mine." The community center bustled with activity as people gathered for the annual fundraiser. Jake moved through the crowd, greeting guests and ensuring everything ran smoothly. Martha stood near the podium, reviewing her speech notes. Suddenly, the doors burst open. Ray strode in, flanked by two menacing figures. The room fell silent as he made his way towards Jake. Well, Ray sneered. Look at you, playing the big shot. Jake tensed, acutely aware of the danger. Ray, this isn't the place. Let's talk outside. But Ray wasn't interested in talking. He grabbed Jake's collar, his voice low and threatening. You think you can just walk away? Nobody leaves you as Jake. Nobody. Martha, seeing the confrontation, rushed over. Without hesitation, she placed herself between Jake and Ray. That's enough, she said, her voice firm and authoritative. This ends now. Ray laughed. Stay out of this, old lady. This doesn't concern you. Martha's eyes flashed. Oh, but it does. She turned to the stunned crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, I have a story to tell you. In a clear, steady voice, Martha revealed the truth about her husband's past, drawing parallels to Jake's journey. She spoke of redemption, of the power of second chances, and of the courage it takes to change. As she spoke, Ray's confidence wavered. The crowd murmured, many nodding in agreement with Martha's words. You see, Ray, Martha concluded, Jake isn't alone. He has a community behind him. And we don't take kindly to threats. Emboldened by Martha's support, Jake stepped forward. It's over, Ray. I'm not that person anymore. And I won't let you drag me back. Ray, realizing he was outnumbered and outmaneuvered, made a last desperate lunge at Jake. But Jake, drawing on his newfound strength, sidestepped the attack. Ray stumbled off balance, and Jake restrained him until security arrived. As Ray was led away, the room erupted in applause. Jake stood, stunned by the show of support. Martha placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes shining with pride. You did it, Jake, she said softly. You faced your past and chose your future. Jake looked around at the faces of his community, people he had come to know, trust, and care for. He realized that this was where he belonged. As the event resumed, Jake and Martha shared a smile, both knowing that while their journey wasn't over, they had overcome a significant hurdle together. The future, once so uncertain, now seemed full of promise and possibility.